here. So you're not going to do it next year.
No, I've done that and crossed that off my list of
Very big things.
options.
You can talk about.
If you have seniority, you should be one of the hosts in the upper levels.
Just to talk about.
Where the fancy
Yeah, every
seats
every
are.
subject
Fancy,
can
fancy.
be a lecture by itself.
Yeah,
But that probably takes a while.
Yeah, you gotta have.
CGB covered later in the
The
year.
other thing is you got to stay up late for those games too.
Well, that's true.
Are you a late person? Or
Not
you-
really, not anymore, especially.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I asked somebody to talk about the more common primary.
So,
The esoteric ones, forget about it. We don't see it. What time did you get back to the city?
I got back about 3 in the afternoon. I had to go out and get the grapes. You know, we were pressing grapes. I got out of the work, but picked that up. So I went home first, and I got my dog car to go get the grapes. One time I spilled 5 gallons of, sweet grape juice all over the back of the car. You never get that car clean again.
You had a good car, that one.
Well, I actually had my father-in-law's car, not mine. So it wasn't quite so bad.
I don't know what happened with those people. I mean, with all these technology, they make the buckle like this.
It's a cute little
yeah, I
town.
mean,
Yeah.
the screw-off caps work so much better.
It has kind of died a little bit, but maybe they're starting to fill in places. You know, it's so hard to make.
So Mike, since you're retired, you just lost your touch here.
Pretty vibrant.
Mhm.
Art galleries.
No, they have a couple of very good art galleries. What time did you get home?
Well, we stopped in Langley, we had a one ferry wait.
I had
There
one.
you go, thank you.
It's funny, I haven't taken that ferry forever, and I thought we were coming into Edmond.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I get off the ferry, and I'm driving, and none of this looks familiar, and then
You talked to Steve at all?
paint field,
Wait,
and all of a
can
sudden
I
I
go up?
realize
Go up
I'm
and down
one
here
ferry
for
stop north of where I think I am.
if he's traveling or not.
Stop in and see what he
GPS
says.
at home to find the shortest route, or you knew it anyway. You know, it's actually easier not to go over to I-5. It's easier to
You
go
go south
and
on
you- that's what you do.
525.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well,
No,
once I
this is
stopped to
low-tech.
figure out where the
Back to
hell it was.
low-tech again.
No, I didn't, I wasn't smart enough for GPS, I looked at an old paper.
It's just big enough for my car.
I'll tell you the shortest route, but anyway, you figure it out. It's not a big deal. You save about 10 minutes, so 5-10 minutes. Yeah, your dog's had a good time, so.
Find out.
So furry one.
Where's parking?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
all that
yeah,
exercise.
I told him, you're an idiot, you
Where
run
are you parking?
Barnacles, yeah, you're gonna cut your feet up. See, my dog is used to it. Probably that heavy.
He's fine by today, but
Oh,
next day, he
Yes.
wouldn't come off, so do it.
oh, yeah. Well, you know, there's one on the
You know, every once in a while, the dog comes in, walks through the kitchen, and there's one of them that he cuts his feet on.
Who's here?
I know, gosh, who is it? I got
Got
up
up.
this morning. Got up. So Tom's actually going to be listening to you. You sent him the link. So
Well, yeah,
he's
I
gonna
added his
listen
name
to
to
it
it.
tonight. He's gonna listen to it tonight or something.
The same thing and check out the street.
Quite well worked out, but thanks anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Good. How are you going?
Good.
Survived.
Yeah, we
Survived
have-
the journey back. We have to wait. You know, we were like very already so
So Mike, did
Really?
I had one very
we
late.
have one.
Yeah.
Do I have a what?
you ever get desperate enough that you come in and play, like have your pitch for example?
But you got right on.
What's new?
You lucked out.
But it takes an hour.
Yeah.
So you have to stay where it says like 60 minutes.
Well, as they always say, next
So you
year,
might have had,
that's-
you said an hour, then you did have one very late.
Yeah, okay.
It goes every half hour. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you anyway.
That's the only distance. I thought maybe there wouldn't be a very line.
But it was really nice. We had such a great experience.
Yeah, we did.
Guidance of domains. Dr. Foote.
See,
Yeah, I'm gonna make it.
They don't demand a lot of time, but
I know, that's probably what I needed.
They've done everything to try to
By the
move.
week. I don't know. Still, it's
Yeah, I'm
I
still
enjoy
with
it,
her.
and I'm over it,
I
but
think there's,
I was just kinda out of commission.
that's accounting.
And
I
then
think
fun.
mine was like
Yeah.
35.
What about this, what about time at 7:45?
I hate it, you know what, we take our boat to all the games, that is so late, we won't get home till like midnight, 1 o'clock.
Yes,
So we may not get there.
Well,
So, they have many more games, I can see a game here or there in the evening for TV, but it's almost like every game now is late afternoon.
Oh, pretty good.
Oh, I wanna go during the daytime.
A little hectic lately.
Yeah.
Never have night games. Yeah, well, Montlake, you know, the Montlake area, they kind of promised us we're gonna have night games. We broke that rule about 12, 10. So now it's shifted totally the other way. Now most games are out. So, you know that, oh, you're coming games. You know, we may not take the vote, but you
You guys are interviewing already?
what are we gonna do with the tickets?
Well, we're getting trade already.
Well, Catherine's gonna go.
How many?
Well, almost 100. So we'll only got a few more. To reach a point where it's the hardest part, I think, is deciding whether
Right.
it's
Easier
really
to pick the
challenging.
2 out of 25?
Somehow, yeah.
good.
It's more of a, I don't know, can't lose mentality. But you always, you know, I mean, like if I was on the other end, I'd be like, personally from now, when it goes on, just like what makes the difference. Sometimes it is.
No, so that's the one that is,
We know.
we had no idea, they didn't tell us when the meeting started.
Like work.
Well, okay, well, round it off to 8, an hour games are at least 3 hours, so 8 to 11, to, you know, especially if it's a good game, it'll go man at 11:30, and then, for us, the ball will be a half hour, and then another hour to get home, plus that just gets you to
And it's not like
report.
No.
I mean, some of it's
So we, as of right now, somebody probably.
I know, yeah, right.
I think I filled out like a 3-page form for grads. That's
Oh,
exactly what
okay.
they called the
Okay.
head
And
guy.
we're
Like called the head guy. And like,
good. Love it. Yeah, college good. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Fine.
The frustrating part, which is true for when the government gets involved with just about anything, is that it's all meetings with this requirements are
Hey, how's it going?
clearly, you know, we're putting that out on people that actually practice. So you're sort of barcoding everything for the government. They don't have to read charts.
Has there
Free,
been a-
free actually.
with them keeping like trying to bring up healthcare, is it like making everything feel like I don't know if this is about to change or not?
No, you're hiring.
Oh,
So that's the other frustration.
And they'd also like to reiterate that, that's the budget. We want to have one program.
Are you sorry? The phone.
Wants to watch our game on the coast, right?
That's right.
Yeah, we know it.
Trying to
We haven't
anticipate
had a
what
kickoff before 5 o'clock this season.
Who said, is that you? Oh, he's right on. Yes. Yeah, so that stinks.
All the into
Stanford also has
a couple more years and then I'll downshift.
8 o'clock start next week.
Not stop. Yeah.
Oh, wait a second, they know the game next week?
So how many of you guys
At Stanford?
do the
Oh, it's at Stanford. But it's 8 o'clock again.
That's what it says, yeah.
I know, right.
Did they say the next game after that, or
It's 6, so it's, you know,
No, Stanford's instead of picking this week,
Yeah.
they by next week.
and it doesn't always work out.
They played.
I kind of know what I started doing is to do the other night, and that's like,
that's this weekend. That's a game.
only one is
Oh,
like,
that's
Five
the
games
game.
this weekend.
I have to check. It's a big meal if you're. I mean, you just,
So, they almost know it's a nuisance for us, because we like
sort of becomes
to take the boat, I'd rather take the day, especially coming home like that, you know? Especially that. bad enough at 5 o'clock, at least you get home like 10 o'clock. When it's a game that late, you get home and get 4 or 5 minutes in your life.
No, I think you've got 4 or 5.
Yeah.
I think the middle.
How about them
sucks.
foods being USC?
Yeah.
But that's different for every
That's one
interview.
of their best wins ever.
So I think I finally convinced everybody to be better. I mean, no one wants to do several half days, but there's a lot of other things if you divide a job into, you know, not proportions.
Yeah.
That's nice to know that it's not just
Infamous or famous would depend on your perspective.
like a central resource center.
How's the
Great.
so I thought of your dad, but Dylan
I think it would probably be easy, because I'll tell you why. A lot of people don't like it. So
Running the resource center just.
so you probably either go online, or if you go to the game and get them scalp cheap. I'm sure you can get that one.
good lord.
On vacation, this is funny. This is her first. They asked me if it was okay to give her pureed pineapple.
Oh.
Basically,
Not a fan.
she is like,
Get inside fish fan?
Hell, you're just sitting.
What's your about for?
Schedule.
yeah, it's amazing seeing this.
Another person has a cell phone that rings like a phone. My wife says nobody does.
Yeah, oh yeah. Oh, no, it's like it's
When?
really small.
Yeah.
You know, it's been 27 years since we had a little one, so it's like, it brings back memories.
It's just interesting that we're all going through the same
It's
stuff.
great because this in town now, thing, like,
Yeah.
Eric is my oldest. He when I kissed her.
That's what my daughter went to.
where is everybody?
I said in State County, we wrote that one. So he's routinely doing about 20.
Morning. Huh? Oh yeah. Learning a lot.
So now between Kaiser, now we have.
Although eventually I need to get a punch to get myself over. Make sure I don't forget. Yeah, my feet's out. We still do like. Although the food challenge is everything. Last time I had it with food challenge. Although now that thing changes in space, it's exactly like the last time before I was out of the journey. So the schedule has turned out so we only get but they sent the screening visit to the other clinic. And there's some political stuff between the nurses and the
So I don't think she.
they couldn't come to the our whole just telling this still. So Suzanne is probably gonna have to. She knows about it. She has to figure it out. But they were sending screening
Twice a week, probably.
like 2 floors higher than. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's gonna have to be worked out.
Although I did unfortunately, they told me to do a 4-year visit, a 4-year weekend.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever said no? I mean, I guess
And Amy would say, you know, because you're used to your mindset of the clinic.
yeah, and you're doing what you would practice.
And then you finally like, okay, and everybody ges comfortable. But hey, the idea is half of these people are, and that's almost exactly the statistics.
Yeah.
You know, because you forget with a lot of the studies, it's like they ask 2 grams. You know,
But it was,
you know,
it
it's
was
like,
great.
well, we don't
There was
really
a
expect that
pretty
for a lot
good
of
sized
these.
sheep.
Yeah,
My
and that's the
grandson
whole
just
point.
walked,
I mean,
run around there and
without going crazy, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to refer our age to 200 or something. Yeah, it's going to be like, you should maybe on vacation.
I was gonna say too, your colleagues like don't you?
Yeah, that's right.
Did you remarry?
It's funny because in our group, I think Mike Weiss is probably the most aggressive. He's an intern. And maybe that's why.
In clinic.
Yeah. But
Yeah, I rotated.
he has a lighter schedule too. I mean, you know.
It's actually closest to Las Vegas in Mexico, and she spends a lot of time out there.
She retired.
Oh, yeah, she
Feel
retired.
free if you want to, you know.
Yeah,
Do a
eventually,
half
probably
day
in a
here
couple
and there.
months, I'll shoot you.
Yeah.
You're making wine, is that what I heard?
I got out because I was on Whitby, but I left my carboys 105s. Actually, the carboys 5 gallons, so 25 liters. Make them 4. We pressed the
Did you miss doing all that, or?
No. You know,
That's the
you don't know when they're going to come. They announce it about 3 days before because you know that's the technical thing. You wait just the right amount of sugar and the right amount of acid and the convenience of cutting it. They don't let you learn just a few days in advance. And I already had rings and things. But I got my carboys. I'll get the reds coming in. You know, we press
I really had to set my alarm.
Well, I got a little bit ahead.
Oh, really?
How many liters do
I set the alarm.
You know what, I actually wrote that down someplace here, when people ask me, I
There you go.
I mean, a gallon weighs 8.4 pounds.
Of course, I don't convert it to liters, like we convert it to bits, but.
Nice.
Well, I'm right here.
Yeah. Oh, do you live back here?
I live,
I can tell you.
That's the thing that sounds weird to me is they don't have.
It's just like you got hours of bits and acre or whatever.
Yeah, I live locked.
Here it's not like the chicken disc is over here, or now it's around the corner.
also,
I mean, it's supposed
Too
to.
much man, too much man. Oh, here it is, I got it by the acre. Yeah. Google it. One acre is about 5 tons of grape. 1 ton is like 600 bottles.
Harvard Clinic, did you ever tell
The
her
bottles, so 3/4 of a liter.
Yeah.
we actually
You're
got
talking like 400.
yeah, so we're really gonna focus on
A couple of questions. For those who have been with us for a long time, I got a nice email the other day from David Hagan, our former fellow who's over in Tel Aviv, who wishes everybody Happy New Year. Wish me Happy New Year. But everybody in the room, whatever religion.
Well, David's actually going to be here in 10 days.
Who will?
David.
He didn't tell me that. And why he can be
It's just kind of transpiring. He'd like to come back here
yeah,
to.
definitely. We'd love to have him back. Oh, David, I hope you're listening. He still gets our broadcasts over in Israel. The other thing I just wanted to ask, parking. Is parking a nightmare for everybody? And you can, this pass, you can open the garage door. And I offered that once before last year, nobody really took up on it, and so I gave up on it. Is it worth it? Bill, you park under the building, don't you?
Mm-hmm. And it's open now because they're remodeling it for this new UW building right, in Dexter.
So it's open to anybody?
Yeah, I mean, you would, You just push a button to open the gate, and then you would pay at the desk, and the desk would be open. Usually, I think at the time this is finished at 8.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
So you wouldn't need a pass to get in? The gate will go up for anybody?
Yeah, you just push a button. There's a that thing is a button to enter, and you'll get a ticket like any kind of paid garage.
Okay, so
But you just need to be able to pay coming out.
something to
So
get
that's
out.
why we'll have to check that there's somebody manning the desk who can.
Okay. What does it cost? Park like for an hour?
Yeah, I've never
Never had
checked
that.
on. Maybe we should.
All right.
We'll talk about it next week, maybe.
So anyway, if
I
parking
gotta
is
get
that question.
enough of a disincentive
Yeah,
to
this
come to
building,
Brooklyn,
yeah.
we can work out a way for you to park and not have to drive around the neighborhood. All right, so Taha, who you met last week, one of our first-year fellows, and his colleague is already on vacation. I didn't know we gave vacation to fellows.
Jamie's getting married this Saturday.
Oh,
That's
good.
why she's got.
You didn't tell me that. I wouldn't. Boy, you know all this. Anyway, I gave him really what is a massive topic, if you broke it down, innate immunity and deficiencies of innate immunity. And he's, from the handout I've seen, he's trying to cover complement, neutrophils, toll-like receptors. Each of those could be a topic in itself, but he's got a very nice presentation for us this morning.
Thank you. So today we're going to talk about the innate immunity and immunodeficiency. It's a broad topic. Okay, I have nothing to disclose here. The objectives of this presentation is to review the different components of the innate immune system and also to review primary immunodeficiency disorders that can affect the innate immune response. And we will be able to cover all the following immunodeficiency disorders that are listed here, but we will be kind of concise in our review for the sake of time. So let's talk about the innate immune system. Some key facts. So the innate immune system is the first line of defense. So it relies on preformed immune factors or innate cells, and they are ready to act. It again kind of distinguishes self from non-self. Otherwise, we'll be in a big trouble. But the way the innate immune system recognizes self from non-self is using limited number of receptors as compared with the adaptive immune system, and kind of compensate by being smart, by detecting components common to kind of many pathogens, yet they don't exist in our cell. Also, the innate immune system induces the adaptive immune response, and the adaptive immune response itself will augment the innate immune response. So the innate immune response consists mainly of two parts: the immediate innate response, which is happening within hours, and the induced innate response, or the inflammatory response, which happens within the first 4 days, and while awaiting for the more robust adaptive immune response to kick in. So our presentation will focus on these 4 days while waiting for the adaptive immune response to kick in. And in order to illustrate the innate immune response, we will follow. Well, I'm going to use this cartoon presentation to illustrate how the innate immune response will respond to an invading pathogen. So let me just orient you to this kind of cartoon graph. So we have here is the physical and physiological barrier, and in this example I'm going to use the respiratory mucosal epithelium. And just beneath the physical and physiological barrier, we have the submucosal tissue with all these innate immune cells. As we see here, also we have the complements, which is a major hemoral component of the innate immune response. We also have here the neutrophils. They are circulating in the blood, but they are also ready to be called in if they need to. And so here we go. This is the organism trying to invade, but the first thing they're going to face is the physical and physiological barrier. So this is a picture from Janeway textbooks looking at the different components of the physical and physiological barrier. And this by itself can really get compromised in many ways. I will pick a few examples. For instance, the tight junctions between the epithelial lining can really get compromised. An example for that will be toxic epidermal necrolysis. And we know that in those patients, the major cause of death is infection. Another example would be the movement of mucous mycelia, which is again can be compromised by smoking. And actually, we see lots of people evaluated for recurrent sinusitis who are smokers, and they get all the investigation for primary immunodeficiencies. Another example would be the low stomach pH, and we know that if we use PPI, you can be at risk of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. You can also get risk of ventilation-associated pneumonia, and also if you go to areas that's endemic in cholera, then also you'll be at high risk. Another example is the normal microbiota. Remember, we give antibiotics. We can kind of kill all these microbiota, and we will kind of give a chance for pathogenic organisms to proliferate. A good example would be C. diff colitis. Another example would be mucocutaneous candidiasis with antibiotic use. So let's say in a way.
Go on.
Yes.
Go back. What are histatins?
It's one of the antimicrobial enzymes that's kind of produced by the epithelial linings and can also fight infections.
They're like defensive?
Yes. And now let's say the microorganism in a way or another was able to invade or overcome the physical and physiological barrier, and now they are the submucosal tissue they're trying to divide. The first thing that they're going to encounter will be the complement system. So let's go over the complement system. I'll go over the complement system a bit more quickly than usual. Just I don't see like so many updates on the complements. So here we have the microbe, and we have our complement system. As we said, they are preformed, they are ready to act. So, and there are many ways to activate the complement systems, but all of these pathways will end up by formation of C3 convertase. So we have the classic pathway, which is activated by antigen antibody complex. And we have the lectin pathway, which is kind of recognizes pathogen-associated molecular patterns, which makes it a little bit more specific. And we have also a steady level of activation of the complements, which we call it the tick-over activation of the complements. And once we have the C3 convertase, it will keep C3 into C3a and C3b. And the major kind of effector molecule of the complement will be the C3bs, the opsonizer. And it's very important in immunity against extracellular pathogens that are encapsulated, because encapsulated microorganisms, they tend to be slippery. The microphages will come in, they can't even phagocytose them, and maybe one of the best ways to do that is by opsonization. Also, the C3b feeds back to kind of amplify the activation of the complements by factor B, forming more C3 convertase. And also, I want to point out that neutrophils, when they start to come into the site of infection, also produces factor P, and this ensures that this C3 convertase stays on the surface of the microbes. Otherwise, it will kind of detaches and will be automatically inactivated. So this will ensure that the activation will continue. And also, C3b with the rest of the C3 convertase is considered C5 convertase, which will convert C5 into C5a and C5b, and C5b with the rest of the complements will form the MAC, which is very useful in kind of immunity against Neisseria. So as we said, because of the complement system gets activated, can have lots of collateral damage. So there has to be many ways to control the complements, and one of the ways is inherited to the fact that to the complements being activated only in the presence of the pathogen, as we see in the lectin pathway. But we have other regulatory proteins, the C1 esterase. We don't have factor P, we don't have an infection, and we have other regulatory proteins that kind of inactivate C3 convertase in a way or another. And we also have the protectin, which prevents the formation of membrane attack complex. So what will happen if you have complement deficiencies? And as we said, the major player of the complement will be the C3b, which is the opsonizer. So, and it's very important in immunity against encapsulated organisms. So if you have C3 deficiency, you will expect infections with encapsulated microorganisms like Strep pneumo, Haemophilus, and also Neisseria. As you go further down, you will be a little bit more specific in that you will be more susceptible to only Neisseria. One of the kind of explanation or theory behind that, why you only get predisposition to Neisseria and not other infections, that Neisseria is kind of unique because it's encapsulated, it's gram-negative, so it will need to be opsonized. However, even after it gets opsonized and phagocytosed, it kind of can live actually inside the neutrophil. So the only way to take care of them maybe is by membrane attack complex. And that's why you get really predisposed to Neisseria with MAC or any deficiency of the terminal complements. Now, if you have deficiency of factor B, again, as we said, the C3 convertase will detaches very easily and will be inactivated, so you'll get the same kind of result. If you have deficiency of the classic complement pathway, the complement components like C1, you will be predisposed to autoimmunity. One of the reasons why is that The early complement components of the classic pathway is really good. It's really important in clearance of apoptotic cells. So if you can't clear apoptotic cells, all these nuclear materials will hang around for a while. This will kind of elicit autoimmunity, autoantibodies against these nuclear materials. These nuclear materials, with the antibodies bound to them, will form antigen-antibody complex. And guess what? We can't even clear these antigen-antibody complex, and that's why we get like SLE with early complement deficiencies. When we have deficiency of the lectin pathway, like mannose binding lectin, you will be predisposed to infection, again with the same type of organism, but since it's kind of specific to the presence of the pathogens, as the adaptive immune response matures, it can compensate for this deficiency, and hence deficiency of mannose binding lectin is no longer considered an immune deficiency rather than a risk factor for infection. Also, we have lots of regulatory proteins. If you use this kind of regulatory proteins in a way or another, you will also predispose to infection. And the reason why is that because if you have lots of these regulatory proteins, you will consume complements more than the liver can kind of keep up with, and you will end up with complement deficiencies and infections. But we have like some classic kind of deficiencies of the regulatory proteins that take classic manifestation, like C1 esterase with hereditary angioedema, the CD55 and 59, the decay accelerating factor, and the protectin, and both of these are actually anchored to the cell membrane by phosphatidylinositol, and hence we can see that if this kind of protein doesn't exist, you will end up with paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. If you have deficiency of the factor I, H, or MCP, which is a cofactor for factor I, you will end up with atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome. There's also factor H polymorphism, which is now associated with age-related macular degeneration, and factor I again, because as I already illustrated, that you will end up with C3 deficiency and recurrent infection. So if you have complement deficiencies, what will be our treatment options? One of the best maybe approach is to be very vigilant to infections, because those people with complement deficiency tends to be very fragile. As we said, like the complements are the first line of defense, so you really have like if the door open and the microorganism can go all the way to the deep organs, so they're at very risk of kind of decompensating into sepsis. So we usually provide them with bracelets, identification badge. So when they go to the ED, like saying, they give me antibiotics and then we can discuss later. Also immunization against encapsulated microorganisms, since they are the most common type of infection you will see. And finally also antibiotic prophylaxis, but this is not for terminal complement deficiency. So let's say the complement was failed to kind of neutralize the invading pathogen. Now this macrophage comes in here to rescue, and there will be kind of a couple questions. How this macrophage is able to recognize this is something that they should phagocytose, how this macrophage will be able to digest, and eventually the macrophage also has an important role in that they should elicit the inflammatory response, they should call for more help, otherwise they will be overwhelmed and the microorganism will find its way to the deep organs. So the way the macrophages do that is by using different types of receptors, and one of the receptors are the phagocytic receptors. And these phagocytic receptors actually tell the macrophage that this is something plausible to eat, this is something that they can phagocytose. These phagocytic receptors are also important in that they also not only tell them that this is something plausible to eat, but they also increase their digestive ability, and we will illustrate that in the coming slide. The macrophage also again has a role in calling for help or calling for more cells, and before they call for help, they need to know what kind of threat so that they can kind of call for the right help. So how do they know the kind of a threat? Is by utilizing signaling receptors, also known now as pattern recognition receptors. And we have a couple of these pattern recognition receptors, and we will discuss them in the coming slides as well. So this is like a picture again from Janeway showing the many phagocytic receptors that the macrophage has. One of them is the dactin receptors, the mannose receptors, the scavenger receptors. And let's see what happens. So we have this gram-positive, it's encapsulating gram-positive bacteria. In this example, I'm using strep pneumo and encapsulating gram-positive bacteria. And these are bacterial products. And it's unique that the bacterial products, when you get a polypeptide with prokaryotic cells, starts with formylmethionine, which the macrophage can recognize that, actually. And also we have, this is the complement, and the complement trying to neutralize, but was failing to do so because it's gram-positive and it's encapsulated, so the MAC doesn't work on gram-positive bacteria. And here's the macrophage is coming to rescue using the phagocytic receptors, able to recognize that this is something plausible to eat or ingest, and they were able to internalize this macrophage in an endosome, forming an endosome. The next step will be to get this lysosome fused with the endosome to form the phagolysosome so the macrophage can digest the bacteria. But this process can really get interrupted in patients with Celiac-Higashi. Patients with Celiac-Higashi, which is caused by mutation in the gene, this gene, they do have trouble trafficking the lysosome to their final destination. This doesn't only happen in the macrophage or phagocytic cells, it actually happens in any cell that utilizes lysosomes. So in addition to the phagocytic defects, we would expect problems like oculocutaneous albinism. And the reason why is that because, again, melanocytes also have melanosomes in them that they cannot traffic properly. That's what you see like in this picture showing the hair from patients with Celiac-Higashi. You see that the melanin pigments has not been distributed properly. They also have bleeding tendencies because platelets also have granules that they want to traffic in order for them to function, and they can't do so. They also will have neuropathies because neurons will also need to get all the neurotransmitters from the cell bodies to the nerve end plates for them to function. In fact, if Celiac-Higashi patients would survive to the 20s, they are wheelchair bound. So one of the things we see to help us diagnose Celiac-Higashi is that we see these giant eosinophilic granules inside the neutrophils. And if we want to confirm the diagnosis, we will look into the genetic testing. So let's say the macrophage here was able to fuse the lysosome with the phagosome and now forming the phagolysosome. Here we have, as we see, is the NADPH oxidase, and it's kind of on the surface of the endosome, but the surface of the lysosome, and when it fuses, will be on the surface of the phagolysosome. It does exist in inactive form. Otherwise, we will be again in trouble because we will have a continuous respiratory burst and we will need to keep up with this high demand of oxygen. So, and as we said though, the phagocytic receptors doesn't only tell the macrophage this is something to eat, but they also increase the digestive ability. One of the ways they do so is that, as we see here, like this is a phagocytic receptor recognizing complements, recognizing bacterial products. This will activate actually the enzyme. How does that activate the enzyme? By giving the cytosolic subunits into association with the membrane subunits. So, and this will generate the respiratory burst. Also, that induces expression of nitric oxide synthase, which will produce nitric oxide as well, which also help with the digestion of the bacteria. So let's take a closer look at the NADPH oxidase enzyme complex. So this is the NADPH enzyme complex. And you see like it consists of multiple subunits, 2 membrane subunits, and 3 cytosolic subunits. And what does it do? It actually converts oxygen to superoxide, and superoxide is dismutase to hydrogen peroxide, and eventually myeloperoxidase to hypochloric acid, which is like a detergent will digest the bacteria. And if you have mutations in the genes that codes to any of these subunits of the enzyme complex, you will end up with what we call CGD. The most common mutation is a mutation in the gene that codes for GP91 subunits in the membrane subunits, and this is the results in X-linked CGD, which accounts for 70% of the cases. The second most common will be a mutation in the gene that codes for the cytosolic subunit P47, which accounts for 25%. The rest 5% will be mutation in the other subunits. So if you have a problem with CGD, what do we expect? Well, the microorganism, as we saw in the kind of presentation, that it was able to overcome the physical and physiological barrier, cannot be neutralized by the complements for a reason or another, and now they have to be neutralized by the phagocytes. And if they cannot be neutralized, you will expect that this microorganism will make its way to the deeper organs, right? And so you will see recurrent bacterial and fungal infections, both superficial and deep, right? And we used to say like it's mostly catalase positive, and the reason why, because catalase positivity will kind of neutralize the hydrogen peroxide, which can also be produced as a byproduct of the bacterial proliferation. But this catalase positive can neutralize this to regular water, so we expect that the catalase positive organisms to be more virulent. However, now we know that catalase positivity is not enough, not even essential. And the way we know that is that we knock down the catalase positive catalase gene from the Staph aureus, the Staph aureus was still able to establish infection in CGD patients. So we have recurrent bacterial infection. The most common fungal infection will be Aspergillus. And we also have inflammatory manifestations. They get granulomas everywhere. And they can get chronic lung disease. They can get inflammatory bowel disease. And also they can get autoimmune manifestations. And the reason why, again, because we need also to clear up apoptotic cells. And if we leave them for a while, then you will be at risk of autoimmunity. In fact, X-linked carrier CGD, the main manifestation will be autoimmune manifestation. The way we diagnose is with dihydrorhodamine testing, and this kind of shows how the test looks like. The first panel is the normal patients. You see that the macrophage responded very well. The second, the one in the middle, is a patient with X-linked CGD. You see that the macrophages didn't budge with lower stimulus. And finally, in X-linked carrier, you see like half of the cells responded and half didn't respond. So what are our treatment options? Well, vaccination is okay with maybe few exceptions. You don't want to give them PCG. It's no longer recommended here, but somewhere else they shouldn't give PCG. Bactrim, prophylaxis, and intraconazole, antifungal prophylaxis, and reduces the risk of both bacterial and fungal infections. And also immunomodulatory therapy with interferon gamma. You'll see how interferon gamma can increase the intracellular killing of the macrophage later in this presentation. Also, hematopoietic stem cell transplants, selected patients. So, finally, I want also to point out this fact that residual net pH oxidase actually correlates with survival in patients with CGD, and that's why we see autosomal recessive CGD tends to do better than patients with X-linked CGD.
So, before you go on, I usually think of that as a neutrophil disease. You talked about it in the context of macrophages. I didn't think macrophages had myeloperoxidase. It's a neutrophil.
Yeah, they do have the net pH to oxidase.
But they don't have myeloperoxidase.
I'm not aware about that, like whether it's myeloperoxidase exists only in the neutrophils or the fact. But I know that the net pH oxidase exists in both phagocytic cells, all phagocytic cells in general.
Anybody want to straighten this out? I don't know.
Okay, so the second, one of the major role of the macrophage is to induce actually the inflammatory response, and we said that before they induce the inflammatory response, they need to actually be able to pick up what kind of threat they are dealing with, and the way they do so is by having signaling receptor or pattern recognition receptors, and the way they call for help is by protections of pro-inflammatory cytokines or other types of cytokines. So let's take a closer look at these pattern recognition receptors. So one of the major pattern recognition receptors, toll-like receptor, it has two, as we see here, like it has two domains. An ectodomain, which is a leucine-rich repeat domain, that's where the ligand binds, and endodomain, also known as TIR domain, and so from toll-like interleukin-1 receptor domain. And this one is actually associated with more subcellular adaptive molecules. And you see here that toll-like receptors actually functions as either dimers or homodimers or heterodimers for them to function. So we have many of these toll-like receptors. We have and as we see there, we have the toll-like receptors 6 and 2, 1 and 2, 5 and 4, and also we have it also on the endosomal membrane as well. And they detect different things. For toll-like receptor 6 and 2 and 1 and 2, they detect the diacetyl and triacetyl lipopeptides of gram-negative bacteria. They also detect the lipoteichoic acids, the lipomannan of the mycobacteria, and also the toll-like receptor 5, for instance, detects the flagellin of flagellated bacteria like Legionella. The toll-like receptor 4 detects the lipopolysaccharides, but it's kind of a little bit kind of unique in that this toll-like receptor is a little bit blind. They need the associated protein we call the MD protein for them to see the lipopolysaccharide. In fact, they also need this MD protein for them to be trafficked properly to the cell membrane. And in addition, also, as we said, in addition to the cell surface toll-like receptor, we have also endosomal membrane toll-like receptor, the toll-like receptor 7, 9, and 3, and these detect more viral products like toll-like receptor 3 detects double-stranded RNA, which is an invaluable kind of intermediate products of viral replication. Also, we have toll-like receptor 9, which detects CpG DNA, the unmethylated DNA, which is a way that the macrophage can recognize this DNA doesn't belong to us. And finally, we have toll-like receptor 7, which detects single-stranded RNA. Also, I want you to know that all of these toll-like receptor uses the adaptive molecule myelodifferentiation 88, or MYD88, with the exception of toll-like receptor is a bit special that it uses different adaptive molecule called TRIF. Also, I want to point out to the fact that all these endosomal toll-like receptors are actually delivered to the endosomal membrane by a carrier protein called ANC93B1 protein. So let's look at the way they signal. So if I'm using the toll-like receptor 4 as an example. If a ligand binds to toll-like receptor 4, the MYD88 will be associated with IRAC kinase, and IRAC kinase will recruit STRAF and TRICA. This will form polyubiquitin with the IKK kinase, and this kind of will be a scaffold for TAC. TAC will activate nuclear factor kappa, which will go to the nucleus and induces the expression of cytokines. On the other hand, if you have toll-like receptor 3, which will detect viral products, and we'll use the TRIF as an adapter molecule, and eventually will activate different transcription factor we call interferon regulatory factor, IFR. And again, this will go to the nucleus and will induce the expression of cytokines, which is a message for health. Now, if you have a problem or deficiency of MYD88 or even IRAC, and as we said, this is something common to almost all the toll-like receptors, what happened here is that the macrophage will able to kind of ingest, will able to digest the microorganism, yet they won't be able to pick up a clue about what they are dealing with, and they won't be able to generate a message for health, so you won't be able to recruit more neutrophils to the site of infections, and this will kind of, the macrophage eventually will be overwhelmed, and this will give access to more invasive infections, so you get invasive biogenic infections. However, these infections tend to do better as the adaptive immune response tends to mature. On the other hand, if you have deficiency of toll-like receptor 3, or the anchor protein that delivers the toll-like receptor 3 to the endosomal membrane, you will be predisposed to herpes simplex virus type 1 encephalitis given in childhood. And you will not be predisposed to other types of viruses, which kind of indicates there's some sort of redundancy in the system. This will also happen if you have a problem with TRIF. Now, sorry. Okay. So, if you have also polymorphism in toll-like receptor 5, there is actually polymorphism in toll-like receptor 5 has been described here at the University of Washington, which results in kind of predisposition to Legionnaire disease. Now, if you have a problem with NEMO or the IKK gamma subunits of the IKK kinase, then you will be predisposed to X-linked ectodermal dysplasia. Immunodeficiency, we'll discuss this later during when we talk about the IL-12 interferon gamma pathway. Now, not all these pattern recognition receptors are membrane-bound. We have also cytoplasmic signaling receptor or cytoplasmic pattern recognition receptors. An example would be the retinoic acid-inducible gene 1, helicase, which detects single-stranded RNA, and the melanoma differentiation associated 5, which detects double-stranded RNA. Unfortunately, there has been no mutation or genetic defects to affect this signaling receptors. And what they do, again, because they are detecting viral products, they will activate the interferon regulatory factor as a transcription factor. We also have other types of pathogenic receptors, the node-like receptors, and they look like the toll-like receptor. They do have the leucine-rich repeat as the site where the ligand binds. They also have, though, a node domain, that's nucleotide oligomerization domain, and based on the adapter molecules that the amino termini of these node-like receptors are associated with, we classify them into subfamilies. One of the subfamilies is the node 1 and node 2, which uses the CART as their associated adapter molecule, and this will activate eventually the nuclear factor kappa. We do have mutations that affect this node-like receptors too. For instance, if you have a mutation that affects the leucine-rich repeat domain of the node-like receptor 2, you will end up with kind of a familial form of Crohn's disease. The reason why is that actually these node-like receptors are also used by the intestinal epithelium to produce an antimicrobial peptides like defensin. And if you can't do that, the kind of the mucosa will be kind of predisposed to infection by the microbiota, and you'll end up like, this is one of the theories that Crohn's disease will happen. Now, if you have a mutation in the node domain of the nucleotide receptor, of the node-like receptor 2, you will actually results in it's a gain of function mutation, so it results in kind of inappropriate activation of the node-like receptors, and it results in a form of inflammatory disorder called Blau syndrome, where they have inflammation of the eyes and the joints. Now, another family of the node-like receptor called the inflammasome, and as we said, because the node-like receptor are subclassified by their kind of associated adaptor molecule, this one uses the pyrine as their associated adaptor molecule. And what does this inflammasomes do? It kind of compares the procaspases to caspases. And the caspases, what does it do? They don't induce the expression of cytokines, rather than release these cytokines to the outside. Because most of these cytokines, when you produce them, they are inactive, and in order for them to be released, they need to be cleaved, and the caspases can do so, and the inflammasome takes the role of that. And important that if you have a mutation in this node-like receptor with pyrine in them, is that you will be kind of having some sort of autoinflammatory disorders, but this is kind of will be beyond the scope of this presentation. Finally, I want to point out to another pattern recognition receptor, the dactyl receptors. We came across this receptor when we were talking about the phagocytic receptors. This is actually a phagocytic receptors, but can also work as a signaling receptors. So they detect fungal cell wall, like beta-glucan and malin, and they signal through SYK and COT9 to induces to activate nuclear factor kappa. So, and we have kind of mutations or problem with COT9. What will happen is that you will be predisposed to mucocutaneous candidiasis. So, kind of this is a counterintuitive, because most of the time when you have phagocytic defects, you tend to have more invasive types of infections, because it's the first line of defense, and if you don't have it, the microorganism will have access to the deeper organs. But in this case, it's actually not an innate immunodeficiency defect. It's that the CART, what does dactin do, or this receptor tells, the macrophage will pick up signal that they are dealing with candida. They will send a signal or a message for help, which will be IL-23, which will recruit Th17 help. And Th17 is very important for mucosal immunity. So if you cannot recruit the Th17 help, you will end up with a problem with mucosal immunity and mucocutaneous candidiasis. You won't have a trouble in digesting or ingesting the candida. You will lose the Th17 help. Okay, so let's say the macrophage in our case was able to recognize what kind of threat. They were able to generate the message for help. In this case, it's pro-inflammatory cytokines. So let's go over these cytokines. So in order for these cytokines to be useful, they need to have a listener first who can listen to their message, to the message. They need to understand this message, and they need to respond to that. So, but sometimes even we don't have a listener. And we have a common example of what we call neutropenia. So under normal circumstances, that's how the neutrophils are developing. In patient with a condition called severe congenital neutropenia, this will not happen. What happens is that there is a mutation in one or two gene, in one gene or another, and because of this mutation, these neutrophils will undergo apoptosis before they make it to the bone marrow. There are many kind of mutations that has been associated with that. The first, which was described by Dr. Kosma in the 50s, he's a Swedish pediatrician, and it's caused by a mutation in HAX gene. But this is kind of a rare mutation, it's autosomal recessive, but the most common will be a mutation in elastase 2 gene, which codes for the elastase. As we said, elastase is one of the digestive enzymes that the neutrophils utilize. And if you have a mutation in this elastase gene, the elastase enzyme that's kind of produced, because most of the time when we produce this elastase enzyme, it's produced in inactive form, and it has to be attached to another inactivating protein. When we have a mutation, the inactivating protein cannot be attached to the elastase enzyme, and hence will be prematurely activated. This will cause stress inside the neutrophils, and eventually the neutrophils will undergo apoptosis before they make it to the blood vessel. Another mutation that I want to point out is a mutation in receptor for GCSF. And it's important because we use GSSF, and the way we think that GSSF is working is by kind of promoting survival signals, which kind of being an anti-apoptotics. So if you have a mutation in the GSSF receptor, and this doesn't work, this kind of promotes apoptosis over anti-apoptosis, and that's why the neutrophils also die. It's also important because this form of severe congenital neutropenia is actually resistant to our conventional therapy with GCSF. Another variant of severe congenital neutropenia that I want to point out is cyclic neutropenia. I want to point out how difficult actually to diagnose this cyclic neutropenia. So in this graph we have like the common cycles of 21 days of normal neutrophil and 1 week of neutropenia. You see that as the neutrophil goes down, that's when the infection starts to happen. But by the time the infection manifested, actually the neutrophils are back up to maybe normal or just below normal. So when we take a snapshot at this time, the neutrophils will be normal, and they are even diagnosed as misdiagnosed as a viral infection because there is no other markers to indicate that there is a bacterial infection. And they also sometimes being misdiagnosed as periodic fever because they tend to have fever every month, but there's no infection that they pick up because the neutrophil just came back. And so this is like to illustrate how difficult and the need for periodic CBC in order to diagnose this condition. Now, another variant of severe congenital neutropenia called myelocathexis. This is from Greek, which means retained in the bone marrow. In this case, the neutrophils actually develop. They are able to exit. However, because of a mutation in the CXCR4 receptor, which is a gain-of-function mutation, which makes it kind of have an enhanced response to chemokines produced by the bone marrow stromal cells, and hence all these neutrophils will have all these adhesion molecules, and they get stuck inside the bone marrow, and they cannot leave to the blood vessels because bone marrow is not the place where the neutrophils can survive. These neutrophils will eventually undergo apoptosis. And we remember that the neutrophils actually lives in the blood; they don't live in the tissue. They have like a few days to live in the tissue before they die. So if they stay inside the bone marrow, it's considered tissue, and again, they will die before they make it to the blood vessels. So this is kind of the mnemonic that we use when they have warts, and we don't know why they do have warts. They do have hypogammaglobulinemia, and one of the reasons is that the B cells actually also gets kind of retained inside the bone marrow. They also have infection, which is kind of self-explanatory, and the myelocathexis. Now, the treatments for this myelocathexis is we give them gamma globulin replacement, we give them GCSF. Actually, GSSF, as we said, it works for severe congenital neutropenia, it works for cyclic neutropenia, and the reason why, because it promotes survival signal, it's against apoptosis, but in myelocathexis, we have one more option, which is Pirexafor. Pirexafor is actually being used in hematopoietic stem cell transplant to mobilize the hematopoietic cells. It's actually a CXCR4 receptor antagonist. So it's been approved for hematopoietic stem cell transplant. It has not been yet approved for WHIM. But all the investigational studies are very promising. And but kind of interestingly, they didn't improve the gamma globulin levels, and I don't know why. So here we go. Let's go over this. Okay.
It's a little complex.
Yeah. So here we go. Let's talk about.
Just skip that. Yeah.
Want to start over? No.
Great talk.
Yeah, it is absolutely. When you were back, go back to the slide where NF-kappa B is sort of the key molecule that they all signal through. Are there diseases where there is an NF-kappa B?
Yes, there's a mutation in NEMO, which is kind of the IKK kinase, because the nuclear kappa B, actually, nuclear factor kappa B is a molecule that dissociates from the IKK kinase. So if you have a mutation in the NEMO, which is kind of a subunit of the IKK kinase, this will not allow the dissociation of nuclear factor kappa. So you will have a trouble with forming the nuclear factor kappa. But we will have this. We will discuss it later when we'll go over the IL-12, interferon gamma pathway, because I will kind of discuss this specifically. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of these cytokines, and the IL-1, IL-6, the pro-inflammatory cytokines, which actually works on the liver, which makes the liver makes more complements, makes the liver makes more C-reactive protein, one of the inflammatory proteins, and actually C-reactive protein can work as an opsonizer. Also, that makes the liver produces mannose-binding lectin, as we saw mannose-binding lectin as one of the activator of the complement pathway, and also works as an opsonizer. IL-6 also works on the bone marrow to promote myelopoiesis and production of more neutrophils. Another important cytokine is the tumor necrosis factor alpha. Tumor necrosis factor alpha does a lot of things. It works on the blood vessels to cause vascular dilatations, increase vascular permeability, promotes expression of adhesion molecules on the endothelial lining. That's what we call activating endothelium. It also works to activate the clotting cascade and promotes clotting, which is important because if you see in this graph, if you have a clotting here, the microorganism has no way to go other than to go to the lymph nodes and face all our lymphocytes. It also works on the dendritic cells, promotes migration of the dendritic cells to the lymph nodes. Also, I want to point out that complements C5a and C3a, they are then aflatoxins. They can also work on the endothelial lining to activate the endothelium. We also have the chemokine CXCL8, which works on the neutrophils to cause conformational changes in their integrins to allow them to establish tight adhesions with the activated endothelium, as we will see in the coming slide. And we also have, and this is how, once this will be activated, the neutrophils will migrate to the site of infections. So here we have the leukocyte adhesion defects. If you have a problem with leukocytes adhesions, is that what happens is that if you cannot get the neutrophils into the site of infection, you'll end up with an infection without neutrophils, so an infection without pus. That's what we call pus. And also, because you have a problem with the leukocytes, because the leukocyte doesn't adhere to the blood vessels, you'll end up by high neutrophil count, what we call neutropenia. So you'll have neutrophils in the blood, but they can't get to the site of infection. They also have, because the neutrophils are very important in fighting bacterial and fungal infection, just like other problem with the innate immune system, we'll have more invasive bacterial and fungal infections. So we have the way the neutrophils kind of adhere to the activated endothelium is using the CLX Lewis, which kind of binds to the selectin on the activating endothelium. And there is deficiency of the CLX Lewis that will happen in leukocyte adhesion defect type 2, which is also known as congenital disorder of glycosylation, which is called mutation in the gene that codes for the GDP glucose-specific transporter, and lack of this, and hence results in lack of expression of the CD15. Problem with, and hence we got a problem with leukocyte rolling, and there's other manifestations like mental retardations and distinct aberrations. Actually, glucose supplementation in this patient has variable efficacy treatment. Now, if this rolling happened and this light kind of adhesion happened, the next thing is that chemokine receptor, the chemokines will bind with the chemokine receptors in the neutrophil. This will induce kind of conformational changes in the integrins, and the integrins will establish tight adhesions with the activated endothelium, and this will promote migration of the neutrophils eventually. So sometimes we don't have this integrin, and that's what will happen in leukocyte adhesion defect type 1 when we don't have the beta 2 subunit of CD18. And hence no expression of integrins, because if you don't have the beta 2, you actually won't express the other subunits of the integrin. And there are two types, severe phenotypes and kind of a moderate phenotype, and there's no specific feature associated with this type. Now, what will happen if you cannot activate or cause these conformational changes in the integrins? You'll still have the integrins expressed, so the CD18 will be expressed, but it will not be functioning. And that's what will happen in leukocyte adhesion defect type 3, or it was previously known as type 1 variants. But because this process of activation of the integrins not only required for beta 2 integrins, it's actually required for beta 3, so we'll expect more manifestations like bleeding because the platelets actually relies on beta 3 integrins for them to function. So let's now turn our attention to different types of microorganism, which is like a virus. So if you have a virus infecting the respiratory epithelium, and as we see here as well in the macrophage probably digests some of these kind of breakdown cells. And when they produce different types of message, here they produce the interferon gamma. The epithelial cells have also signaling receptor. They can also detect type of threat, and they can also produce interferon alpha and beta, And this interferon alpha and beta will work on neighboring cells, make them more resistant to viral infection. It works on natural killer cells, it increases their ability to kill, and also works on the dendritic cells and macrophages to promote them to go to the lymph nodes and present the antigen because they want the cytotoxic T lymphocytes to come in and help with this viral infection. Another thing that I want to point out, if you have an intracellular bacteria like Mycobacteria or Salmonella, you'll have this kind of interchange of messages between the macrophage and natural killer cells, which will help in neutralizing intracellular pathogens. So you have a macrophage producing IL-12, the natural killer cell will return the message by producing interferon gamma, which will increase the intracellular killing of the macrophage. So as we said, you need a listener. I mean, the listener was able to respond. So we said if you don't have a listener like in neutropenia, you will be in trouble. Or if you have a listener but he doesn't have the integrants to come into the site of infection, we'll also be in trouble. But there's other types of trouble. What if the listener is there, is able to respond, but the problem he's unable to understand your message because of problem with the signaling receptors, and the signaling of their receptors. And the best way to illustrate this is by going over the IL-12 interferon gamma pathway in patients with Mandela susceptibility to microbacterial disease. So here we have the mycobacteria inside the macrophage. The macrophage is able to pick up the type of the threat, and because of this type of threat, they will generate the right message for help. In this case, will be IL-12 and IL-23 in case of the dendritic cells. And these IL-12 and IL-23 actually share the same subunits, the P40 subunits. And they also work on a receptor, the IL-12 receptor or IL-23 receptors. And both these receptors actually also share the beta-1 subunits. And this will signal through tyrosine kinase and STAT4. And the natural killer cells respond by kind of texting back the interferon gamma to the macrophage. And the macrophage will pick up the signal through interferon gamma receptor. It has two subunits, R1 and R2. And this will signal through JAK2 and STAT1. And STAT1 will kind of induce expression of enzymes required to increase the intracellular killing of the macrophage. They also kind of induces expression of more IL-12. So they want to kind of the interchange of messages to continue to ensure that this the intracellular pathogen will be killed. We also have another transcription factor that the interferon gamma can activate, which is interferon IRF8, which actually mainly induces the expression of IL-12. Now, we have also other ways to increases the ability of macrophages to kill intracellular microorganisms. But the way they do so is by help of T-cell receptors through CD40 ligand and CD40 signaling if we need one. If you have problem in interruptions at any point of this kind of interchange of messages, then you will end up with susceptibility to microbacterial diseases, both TB and non-tuberculous microbacteria. So if you have problem with the P40 subunits, which can affect either interleukins, if you have problem with beta-1, tyrosine kinase, interferon gamma receptors, or if you have a problem with STAT. And in all of these cases, you will end up with susceptible to microbacterial diseases. Now, if you have a problem with IRF, again, you will be susceptible to microbacterial diseases. And if you have a problem with NEMO, again, you will be susceptible to microbacterial disease. And the way they discovered this, actually, they were looking to why people with HIV are predisposed to microbacterial diseases. When after we understand this pathway, they wanted to understand why people with HIV. Yes, please.
If you look at people who have mycobacterial disease, do they, in just normal patients, do they have any of these defects, the people that just get mycobacterial disease?
Not all the people who have microbacterial disease will have a defect, but I mean, certainly this kind of predisposes a patient to microbacterial diseases. I mean, if you have, the idea is like if you have infections with atypical mycobacteria, these atypical mycobacteria, they exist everywhere actually, but usually our immune system is able to contain them and they will never give us a trouble. But if these atypical mycobacteria were to exist as an infection, this kind of should triggers that we should think about the possibility of interruption at any point of this pathway, and we should look into that. And there's actually genetic testing for all of these to identify these mutations. Now, let's turn our attention to the final player of the immune system, the natural killer cells. They're part of the innate lymphoid cells. They're recognized by being CD3 negative, CD56 positive, and CD16 positive. And there are kind of two populations of natural killer cells that I want to point out. There's the CD56 dim, that's the mature form, the one in the green, and the CD56 bright, that's the immature form. Okay. And the way the natural killer cells actually kills is that there are many ways. There is cell-cell contact using the granzyme and perforins, and also by antibody-dependent cytotoxicity. And one would say, like, if you rely on antibody, then it will not be an innate immune response. But we have to realize that there are natural antibodies produced by innate B cells. These does not require prior exposure to a pathogen, and they tend to have limited specificity. So all phagocytic cells and natural killer cells can kill using antibody-dependent cytotoxicity that's purely innate. Now, what happens if you have natural killer cell deficiencies? So there are a couple types of natural killer cell deficiencies. There's either decreased number or decreased functions. So with decreased number, there are two subtypes. Classic natural killer cell deficiency subtype 1, caused by mutation in GATA2 mutation, which will result in susceptibility to mycobacterial in addition to the susceptibility to viral infection. So in these cases, in subtype 1, we'll have deficiency of both, all types of natural killer cells, the dim and the bright. Okay? In subtype 2, the bright portion is actually preserved, which tells me that the problem in people with subtype 2 is not a problem with the natural killer cell maturation. It's a problem rather than not a problem in making the natural killer cells. It's a problem with natural killer cell maturation. So you will not have a mature natural killer cell that's able to kill. In functional natural killer cell deficiency, the numbers are okay, they just don't function. And in all of these cases of natural killer cell deficiencies, you would expect susceptibility to viral infections, especially with the herpes pattern. And this comes to the end of the presentation, and if you have any questions?
I don't have a question, but I'd just like to say that was outstanding. That was great. Better than any board review or college, academy, or otherwise, or break. That was really outstanding.
You were going to come back to NF-kappa B, which seems really like a very central molecule, or because it seems to me that would almost be a lethal defect because it's such a central molecule.
Yeah.
Is it?
I didn't go. Actually, I'm not like. I think nuclear factor kappa B will be more maybe addressed as far as other primary immunodeficiencies like severe combined immunodeficiencies because it's being utilized by many other cells as well. But if you have, I think the only mutation that is known to be associated with innate immune defects is the NEMO, which is as already illustrated, is kind of a portion of the IKK kinase complex, and because and those people tend to be susceptible to mycobacterial diseases in addition to viruses, and because this kind of IKK is being used by both adaptive immune cells and innate immune cells. In fact, it's even used by the skin. That's why you get ectodermal dysplasia. So it's kind of very wide manifestations, and it will be like beyond the innate immune deficiency itself. And actually, I don't have enough information to cover that.
To directly answer that, it is lethal without bone marrow transplant, so it's a very severe disease.
Is there a name for it? Emo.
Yeah.
I would, frankly, if you had all that information in your head with no notes up there, that's one of the most awesome presentations I've ever heard. And in fact, if you do it again.
Yeah. I think one thing to point out on this, so like to Paul's question, there's testing for all of this, and more and more discoveries in each of these pathways are being made all the time. So they're both functional tests. So Troy, for instance, has an IL-12 interferon gamma pathway, as does the Medical College of Wisconsin. So you can screen for each of these and then also drill down in terms of genetics. And shortly there will be a genetic panel run out of the UW that will cover pretty much all of this. It'll have about 400 genes on it. So it is worth looking for these because, recognition for one, and then there are therapeutic approaches for each of them.
I guess for the average clinician, you just have to think, what's the major pathogen the person's, is it mycobacteria, is it viral, is it staph? And then you at least have a rough idea what genetic test to order, which is, I don't know, for the average, for me, I won't talk about anybody else, for me, that's the best way I could think about it as a clinician.
Which makes sense, because there's obviously several ways you can get to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where, the current state of the art, everything's moving towards sequencing. The problem is all of these have sort of variable manifestations, variable penetrance.
Right.
You don't always get a functional readout. So what certain people are doing, such as this panel Troy has and so forth, is trying to functionally characterize many of these underlying genetic disorders as well.
Some of the manifestations seem unpredictable. One of them up there, I don't remember which one, had mental retardation as a manifestation.
Yeah, the one with the leukocyte adhesion defect type 2.
Is there any logical explanation
Yeah, because
for that?
I mean, I think it involves more of a glucose metabolism, so it can be have broad manifestation as well.
Well, for those of you who didn't memorize all of that, we have someone coming a little bit later in the year just talking about CGD, and then I think I asked Jay to do the most common of the primary immune deficiency diseases, because most of these are so esoteric that those of us who are clinicians will never see this disease, or if we see it, we won't know it. So we'll come back to these topics again. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
It'd be a shorter day.
If I could remember 10%, I'd be happy.
It's going to be hard kind of doing that.
That's funny. I was talking to our rheumatologist, and we were talking about
That's only
share of
the
He told me that all of everybody is 18 hours.
You know, the people in the middle, because you sort of remember the beginning when you're fresh, and then it's like human nature, the last two people.
The last couple you can remember that, yeah. Interesting to track our...
I know, yeah. I mean, the only good news is that it's different for all of us.
Yeah, it's totally mixed in.
Yeah, so that's the value of that.
Okay, well, look forward to seeing you Thursday.
We want to have an old doctor's feature this year.
Yeah, it's just
Planned it at the beginning of the year instead of the end. So if you guys want to come to Whistler and go ski for a weekend and talk about this crap.
We're like, you know, not letting me speak to anything, but, you know, we're really excited.
Yeah, my brain's too much.
I mean, it's very, I mean, we're like,
How's that?
can I just get a photo with you for like 1 month?
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So, maybe soon enough.
So you're going to do a lab in Akron, or you're just going to...
You know, they like scare you. So like, it really does. I'm sure all of you guys.
No. So now with all this stuff that they're doing, have they found a way to turn on B cells? I mean, we got all these defects and all these pathways and everything, but if we could figure out how to turn B cells back on instead of having them turn off. I mean, I listen to all these transmitters and I was like, we just need to find out what switches off B cells.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Half of your life would be gone and you'd have time to do the rest of your life. So nothing so far.
I'm not even really,
Congratulations.
it's exciting. It's never I mean, well, the neat thing, when you're category 5, over time, that defect is Santa Clara and and so if we can find what is Jeffrey's here.
So that's what I keep thinking. We got all these great genetic things now. We can tell all these people that are going to die. You can't do anything for them unless you bone marrow trace them. Can't we just find one thing to like turn things back on?
No interest there at all.
There was some old literature from about the time you were born that they were experimenting by giving it called super high dose indomethacin and cymidity, and they were able to generate a boost in their immunoglobulin production. But they all got ulcers from their indomethacin, so it really wasn't viable. But there's obviously, and they talked about the H3 receptor and how antagonist did something to that. I can't find any recent literature on any of that, so it must have died 20 years ago when my brain started. But there's got to be something that we can do.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's working on that. My understanding is that it's
Take some of the rain better tomorrow, take some of our rain.
people are trying to make synthetic
But you can't. Here, put the top on.
that idea. I mean, I guess, the other thing that happens some of these you can
It's just decreasing metabolism. You get different. You get exposed like 3 or 4 times. But anyway, I just want to thank you for seeing all my folks.
Yeah, well, always happy to. Trying to have enough time to do things, but please keep that.
Oh no, I can answer your questions badly, and you can answer your questions really well. Just go see them.
We're happy to do it.
Well, I'm glad you're happy to do that. But I keep finding them, so I can keep sending them.
They're out there.
Yeah, they're out there. Thank you. Well, and I only retained about 2% of that lecture. It was like an organ. That was like a course review. Oh. That I've forgotten. I know, but I mean, I've forgotten. You just told us, and it's like scary.
And you and Jay had a good.
Yeah, we did. We did.
Yeah, we've never
Yeah,
had
and then I think he said he was going to hold off on the
player.
health population management.
And the other ones, I don't believe have like questions. We have to get everything out.
Here, give him this. That fruit. I'll get this.
You were trying to put it in here?
Yeah. Slippery little booger.
Take some of this down to Renton.
You still want this mail?
Who's breaking down the
No, Andrew was setting it up. Andrew?
Okay.
You don't want an orange juice?
You seem to be younger all the time. I think, what is it? Something in that lab? Is it a special something? Is it something for keeping you going and everything?
Yeah, it's kind of rejuvenated, I guess, right?
Are you doing a lot of research?
We've got this one of
I'm leaving town.
areas.
So do you want veto or what do you want?
No, if you find a place, I would order my Quran. You guys find a place.
As a particular response.
So they need
Those exact items?
Just standard high dose.
I'll call around, see if we can see them in person. You haven't seen them in person?
Correct.
Okay.
so like
A new one where they got really bad and you tried to suppress with histamines.
And that's
At that
Matthew,
point.
right? Your son?
Yeah, it was older.
Now, what is he? He's in research here? Or
He also sees patients.
he sees patients where?
Here, it's you.
Okay.
Well, I know
That's yours.
to what they need to do.
You dump it on the floor?
What?
Blood.
Chronic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Very good.
blood draws before each case.
So they would just be referred to the allergy.
Who's breaking
breaking
And
down
then
this room.
at Steve Tillis, the fraternity, doing a clinical recruiting at asthma. And then once we get to 20, we've got 11 patients. And